Hi, I'm Liz Dyer, founder of Serendipity Doodah, home of the Mama Bears and the Real Mama Bears organization. We support and empower families with LGBTQ members and the LGBTQ community. And today I'm excited to be here with Hannah Hollander, the founder and community leader of Speak Your Truth, a private Facebook group that amplifies voices of victims and survivors of domestic violence.
Mhm.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for being with us today.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me. I'm excited to be here and talk about this. It's really important. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I think a lot of people don't realize how important it is also for the LGBTQ community. There seems to be a little bit of thought that domestic violence is and domestic abuse is not a problem in the LGBTQ community like it is for heterosexual people. But that isn't true, is it? You were sharing some staggering statistics with me that really shocked me.
Yeah, it is actually, it was enlightening for myself to find these statistics and kind of recognize how it affects the LGBT plus community because it really that assumption that it doesn't happen in the LGBT plus community, it is an assumption and it isn't reality, unfortunately. So yeah, it's been proven that almost 44% of lesbian women and over 60% of bisexual women have experienced rape, as opposed to the 35% of heterosexual women. And then, transgender victims are more likely to experience intimate partner violence in public versus, those who don't identify as transgender. And 20% of those who identify as LGBT plus, have experienced some form of physical violence, which is almost on par with, the whole society. We say that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience some form of intimate partner violence in their lifetime. This is like, a huge portion of society. And we want to bring awareness to it as much as possible. It's not talked about nearly enough. And I remember reading a book once that said, if we were able to fix domestic violence and child abuse, so many of these other problems we have in society, it would be fixed as well, because so much stems from domestic violence.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's an excellent point. Yes.
Yeah.
And that makes so much sense. I mean, it really does matter that we talk about this. And I think, it is a subject that a lot of people don't talk about. Don't you find that?
Yeah. Well, it's a hard subject, because because it affects so many people. You know, like I just said, 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, but there's also perpetrators doing that. So it is difficult, to talk about in a society that, you know, highly values marriage and, has these kind of strongholds that make it difficult for victims to leave. Another thing is the average abusive relationship is a decade. And so, a lot of people think, if you're being treated like that, why would you stay? Like, why would, it's always kind of put on the victim, like, why would you deal with that? You don't deserve that type of thing. And it comes from a good place. Like, I think that it does, come from a good place when people have those questions, but there's really just so much lack of education around the subject as a whole. And so there's a lot of assumptions made, that it only affects certain demographics or even certain socioeconomic, but the reality is it literally affects everyone. It doesn't matter your race, age, gender, sexual orientation, ability. It affects everyone. And what's interesting is that actually, if you are identify within a marginalized community, it might affect your community more. So yeah, we just like one of our as a nonprofit, we are officially a nonprofit as well. Our nonprofit is called Speak Your Truth Today, and we our goal is to provide education and prevention of domestic violence. And so we hope to someday actually create curriculum that can be taught in workshops and schools and stuff like that. But we actually have on our website, which I can share when this is posted, but we do have some toolkits for parents actually to help them teach their children at these different ages and educate them on abuse, because once they're in the relationship, it's almost too late. Like you have to educate your children beforehand.
Yeah, that's such an important point, because I think once people, and especially once our kids are in a relationship, they're resistant to us interfering. And, to some degree, we have to respect those boundaries, because, if they are adults, they have the right to say, who can get involved, who can give advice, that kind of thing. So it can be a difficult situation. So yes, I love this idea. And that's what we always want to do for the mama bears, is really help them become well informed and educated so that they can help their kids be well informed and educated. Like you said, I think that some of this can be avoided if people are well informed even before they start forming relationships. And, we can empower our kids to be on the lookout for these flags and things themselves. I love this work that you're doing. And, just for those that are listening, it was such a treat for me to get to connect with you through the Facebook Accelerator program that we were both in for like the last year, working our rear
Tails
ends
off.
off.
Yeah.
But that was fun and worth it. And we learned so much and we made so many great connections. I know the story of how you started Speak Your Truth, but I would like for you to share that with those who are listening, because I think it's really important for people to understand that you have a personal connection to this work. And that's why I think, you can offer, something to people in these situations that not everyone could.
Yeah. So I actually posted my own story. That's how it all started. Was I posted my own story on Facebook. I came from a very small town, religious town. There was like a church on every street corner. Marriage was very highly valued and divorce was looked down upon. And I grew up in this kind of culture where it was very normalized to get married young. And so I actually married my ex at 20 and then ended up leaving 3 years later. But yeah, after I left, I just like, I didn't even realize what I was experiencing was abuse until after I left. And then I started getting all of this education. I was just like inhaling it. And I was actually in a very angry stage because I found out that, 4 immediate family members, 2 aunts and 2 grandmas had also experienced domestic violence and divorced their ex-husbands over domestic violence. And I was never told their stories. I was never educated on what, my parents have a wonderful relationship, but was never educated. They just didn't think it was going to happen to me, or my siblings. And so they didn't see the need. They thought they were living by example, that they had a beautiful relationship and respected each other and stuff. But I didn't know what unhealthy looked like. And I was constantly told that marriage was hard. Marriage is hard. You get through it and it gets better, kind of thing. So anyways, yes, posted my story in hopes actually to reach my hometown, because I knew that people were experiencing it in my hometown, but it wasn't being talked about. And so it started going a little bit viral. And I was receiving hundreds of messages and comments from fellow survivors that needed support. And I was super overwhelmed. And I was like, oh, these people just need to talk to each other and encourage each other, So I kind of on a whim, made the Facebook group and edited it into my original post. And at that point, it had been shared 3,000 times. And then it went on to be shared over 120,000 times. So we had 12,000 members in the first 2 weeks, which was insane. But I really, we really saw the need for it. We're really serving kind of a niche within the domestic violence space that isn't being, offered. We're able to walk with the survivor on their entire journey out of abuse and offer so much education and be a network of resources for them. So yeah, we, developed rules and regulations and developed this amazing volunteer team. And so the space itself in our support group is like the most empowering and really safe, space to talk about these really sensitive topics. And we've journeyed with, I just saw, a post the other day that was of a mom that, when she joined, she was really confused about her relationship, didn't quite know if what she was experiencing was abuse. And now 2.5 years later, she is announcing that she finally called the lawyer and they set a date to get filed and because she's so ready to leave. And so we've been able to walk with her for, 2.5 years now. It's just very, very meaningful. And so, yeah, so we accept everyone who wants to learn about domestic violence as well. If you're not a survivor yourself, we still accept you as long as you're, answering the questions and you're there to offer support and learn, from fellow survivors. So yeah, it's been a little bit crazy journey. I never thought this would happen from one Facebook post, but here we are. So, but yeah, we're growing very rapidly and trying to get the word out to domestic violence nonprofits nationwide.
Well, that's great. Now, what year did you start this?
I launched the group in 2019, so it's been just over 3 years. Yeah, we got our 501c3 status last May, so we just surpassed a year for the 501c3. Yeah.
Well, congratulations on everything, and it's such important work. One thing I noticed you said when you were talking about the mom who, came into the group and wasn't sure if she was experiencing domestic abuse, and now she's at a place where she is ready and able and equipped to leave. When you and I were talking at one point, you talked about that a lot of people don't understand or, have a hard time comprehending that it's a process for people to, recognize that they're in a situation where there is abuse taking place and then becoming equipped emotionally and maybe practically also to get out of that situation. And I think one thing that and we'll talk about that, but one thing I love about your group is I feel like it helps people get through that process quicker than they would on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. There's a statistic that says the average time that a survivor leaves and goes back until they leave for good is actually 7 times. They will fully leave and go, and that's the average. So, a lot of these relationships, because when you're in an abusive relationship, it is so confusing. You have like wool over your eyes, you know what I mean? Like it isn't until you're fully out and fully severed that you really take those rose-colored glasses off, or because you're gaslit, you're manipulated, you're just in this very, very confused, and you love your partner. Like
and also some of this stuff happens gradually, right? It's like a buildup.
Yes.
So like what happened 2 years ago, now it's grown into something else.
Yes. And there's also stages. So there's a lot of abusers do something what's called love bombing. So love bombing is like, at the beginning of the relationship, you are their center of attention. They flower you with gifts and notes, and it feels like a fairy tale. And that was my experience with my ex. And then they move very quickly. So they want to get you committed very quickly. That's a big red flag. If they're talking about moving in with you, or they're talking about having a child with you, or getting married, that's very quickly, or saying I love you, saying things like I've never felt this way about anyone before. That can be red flags of an abusive person. And so
That's when
yeah,
maybe the saying, if it seems too good to be true,
it
it might
might
not be true. Yeah.
yeah. Yes. And then, yes, just like what you said, it does gradually grow. There's this thing that we call the cycle of abuse. So, and it's, I would say it's almost like a spiral as well, because, so basically the way that the cycle goes is that, there's like the honeymoon stage, and then there's tension building, and then there's the really, really bad thing that happens. And then there's the kind of apologizing or going back to normal stage, or like what's it called, where just nothing is happening basically, and then it's like you're being love bombed, and then so that there's that cycle. And in abusive relationships, that cycle will happen quicker. Like there'll be more abusive actions that happen, because the other thing that people don't really think about is that abusive people are not abusing their victims 100% of the time. If that
Right.
were the case, people would probably leave, but they're actually not abusing them 100% of the time. And so that's that part that makes it so confusing for,
And the other thing is, there is often times where I want to say they seem, but maybe they are truly remorseful, but they're not doing anything
there's no
to
action
change.
behind. Yeah, so that's another thing, is they will apologize. My ex was actually unique in the fact that he never apologized. It was always all my fault. But that is a tactic that a lot of abusers do, where they will apologize, but there is no action behind it. And then when a survivor does decide to leave, the reason why so many come back, one is because resources are scarce. There's a lot of them have children, can't survive on one income. But another huge reason as to why survivors end up going back to their abusive relationships is because the victim or the abuser what I call is flipping the script. So they were blaming everything on the victim at one point, and now they're taking all the responsibility. They're promising they're going to change. They're going to counseling. They're seeing a psychiatrist. And so the survivor thinks, oh, finally, this is what I've been wanting the whole time. Actually, but it's really just to get them back into their cycle and to get them back under their control, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so much. I could talk about it for days.
No, I think, all those things are really important. And, we're going to have you in the group for a couple of days, where if people want to ask a question in the comment section of this video, that, they can. And if you have time, you can try to answer it. You're going to also share some resources. And then, of course, people can join your group also, where they can learn a lot and get connected to a lot more resources. And, sometimes you just learn so much hearing other people's stories, and especially people who maybe have been through something you're going through, but they're ahead of the curve. So that would be very beneficial to anybody. And maybe, like you said, some of these mama bears may want to join your group to learn more. Maybe they're not victims, and maybe their kids are not victims. Maybe their kids not even at the age where they're dating yet, but they want to get better, information. They want to be better informed, so they can help, their kids grow into the kind of adults that might recognize these red flags and be able to avoid some of these situations.
Yes. Proactive parents are the best parents.
Yes, yes, definitely.
Proactive. Yes.
Yes. And mama bears love to be proactive. They really do. They're really committed to, learning and growing, so that, they can be the best parent they can for their kids and help their kids grow up into, well-rounded, whole and healthy adults.
Yeah.
Okay, so another thing that I wanted us to touch on here is um, the LGBTQ community has some specific barriers when they go to seek services and receive assistance. Like you said, I mean, resources are sparse anyway for anybody, but our kids who are in the LGBTQ community might face some extra obstacles, some extra challenges. So let's talk about those.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. We already kind of talked about the society beliefs that it doesn't happen to the LGBT plus community, and that is false. Another thing is, uh, unfortunately, that there's still even in this day and age, there's still people that discriminate against LGBT plus uh, identifying people. And so that happens in shelters, and I would say probably especially rural areas. It is improving, I would say, but again, that's a problem, and it actually is a big barrier for LGBT plus identifying people that to seek services, because they are afraid of being discriminated against. Another thing is that sometimes a lot of shelters, this is changing recently, but most shelters still only allow women in their shelters. And we're gender affirming in our support group. We recognize that abusive and survivors of abuse, abusive people and survivors of abuse can be any gender. It doesn't matter what gender you are. You can be a victim, you can be a abuser. And so we welcome all genders in our support group, but there's still a lot because of the way that the history of domestic violence has kind of been tried to solve. It came up as a women issue, in like the 60s or something like that. But and so when a lot of these shelters started forming, it's been women only. And so like transgender folks, get that discrimination, or they might not be allowed into shelters still. Although it is changing, and we are seeing a lot more shelters accept men and accept any gender, because that's what's needed. It doesn't matter. We have men on our leadership team too that they've really opened my eyes to the realities of abuse against men, because you think that it would be different, but really it's so much the same. And so anyways, that's a whole nother topic. But another specific kind of barrier or danger within the LGBT plus community is outing. That's very, very common amongst abuse, or the threat of outing. A lot of LGBT plus identifying people don't necessarily or might not be out to their closest friends or family. And so for a partner to threaten that's super isolating. And so that would really stop them from seeking assistance or support.
Oh yeah, like maybe especially for bisexual or transgender people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
if you are in a same-sex relationship, that might not hold true, but you could be a transgender or bisexual or pansexual or omnisexual, someone who could be still in a relationship with, opposite genders, but still not want to be outed. Okay, I had not thought about that. That's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, and then, let's see here. I'm reading.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
and you had also mentioned, which I think is good to point out, that some LGBTQ people might not want to say that they're experiencing this because they're afraid that it would just reflect badly on the whole community, and the idea that same gender marriages, that whole kind of idea that these kind of marriages can't work anyway. These kind
Right.
of relationships can't
Right.
work. And so they may feel guilty that they, you know, or shameful that they have to say, my relationship's not working out and this is happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's a huge one that I didn't even think of. Yeah. Yeah, it's massive. But yeah, I think the only other thing that I have here is the just the lack of awareness of LGBT plus friendly resources. And so that's the other thing that I think is so important for especially your mama bears, to just be educated on the resources, just in case it happens, because I always say if or when it happens, um, because 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men means that, it's going to have, if it doesn't happen to yourself, it's going to happen to someone, and being able to, know if those resources can be literally life or death for people, in these relationships. So I'm going to share, a bunch of resources, in the comments. But I think one thing that would be, really helpful for us to discuss is the power and control wheel that's specific to, LGBT plus community.
Yeah,
Because
I found
yeah,
that very interesting when you shared that with me. So I want to share my, let's see here.
share your screen.
Yeah, I want to share my screen. Sorry. I
Oh,
can't, I was looking for the buttons before I said it. Okay,
yeah,
so
yeah.
I have this pulled up and I want so that it'll, everyone can see it while you're talking about it. Excuse
Yeah.
me.
Yeah. So something that we teach is that abuse is all about power and control. So as I mentioned to you, before we hopped on, was that abuse in all different relationships can look very, very similar, but the actions sometimes are the things that look different for different communities. So like we said, the outing, that wouldn't necessarily happen in a heterosexual relationship. But this power and control wheel, what's fantastic is there's a whole bunch of these. If you look up power and control wheel and you look up a specific community on Google, you'll be able to find and what's great about these wheels is that they actually give real life examples of what it can look like. So for instance, um, threats, making emotional, physical, economic, or sexual threats, threaten to harm family and friends, threaten to make a report to the city or federal authorities that would jeopardize custody, economic situation, immigration or legal status, all of those things. Threatening suicide is another thing that I think might touch in the LGBT plus community as well. Suicide is such a difficult topic, and when you're in a relationship and someone is threatening suicide, there's a difference between someone who is actually suicidal and someone who is threatening suicide. And threatening suicide is abusive if you are not suicidal, because that begs a certain reaction, from your gaining power and control over your partner by threatening that. That's the point of threatening that. So it's just interesting. I would highly recommend reading this in detail. I can bring up a couple more that I think is interesting. We just went through, April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and sexual assault, happens in the LGBT plus community, just as much, if not, more than other communities. And so, and I can provide some statistics there as well. It's just important to be aware of, but sexual abuse and sexual assault can look differently. I feel like when the topic of abuse comes up, oftentimes people go to the worst things, right? The actual act of sexual assault, the physical act of hitting or kicking or something like that. But there's honestly so much that happens before it ever gets physical. That's not okay. Yeah, like refusing to practice safe sex, not respecting contraceptive, needs, or safe words, stuff like that. Is there's just so much here. So, yeah. Oh shoot, you're muted for me. I can't hear you. I wonder how that happened. Here I was talking. I don't know if you interjected at all, but
No, this is the first time. I was just listening up until this point. I'm sorry. I muted
no
myself
worries.
because I coughed a couple of times there.
Oh,
Um, I also thought isolation
yeah.
was something that we might talk on because I think that gives a lot of power to the abuser, doesn't it?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, totally. And I think that can be even, when I, I can imagine that when you're in you identify in the LGBT plus community, you're in this relationship, that starts wonderful and then, gets worse and worse and worse. And then they start isolating you from your friends and family. Like that is so difficult. I think, especially for LGBT plus, people, because, um, yeah, it's just the isolation, restricting your freedom. You might already feel isolated as, an identifying, LGBT plus person. Um, so being isolated even more, they will use, relationships against them. So that's another really important thing, I think, as parents to understand and recognize in your child's relationships, because yeah, it can be very, very complicated. And again, like we said earlier, like being proactive is so important, because once they're in the relationship, and we have this in our support group, where topics have come up where, parents, the mothers or fathers joined the support group because they were leaving themselves, or they were receiving support for themselves, but now their child is going through it, and it's just so, it's like triggering for them, but also they don't know how to help. And what's really difficult is, once someone is in an abusive relationship, there's only so much you can do. They have to make that decision for themselves to leave, or else they're just going to be wrapped into this cycle. And so education is super important. We have a whole portion on our website that I can tag as well, that it's called What to Say and What Not to Say. And it is like, I always send people there when they're friends or family members of people that are going through these relationships, because it's like, it's just so great. So one thing is calling it what it is, being educated and knowing the language around abuse, because language is so important. Once you name something, like, that's manipulative, like, whoa, that's like, or naming it, that's sexual abuse, or that's physical abuse, like naming it and calling it what it is really puts it into perspective, I think. And not just calling it toxic or whatever, but actually naming it what it is super important.
Yeah, that'll be a great resource. That will
Yeah.
be.
Yeah.
Well, Hannah, I just really appreciate this time, and I know it's going to be so important to our community. What advice would you give to mama bears? Let's just say in general that all mama bears, what advice would you give them so that they can, help their kids develop into whole and healthy adults who are empowered to either make sure this doesn't happen to them or to know how to stand up to it if it does?
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good question. There's so many things, right? Education is just like our core belief that, being educated yourself and then, educating your children, like, that's, the number one thing for me. But I would also say, listening. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I don't have children myself, but I have a lot of friends that have parents, and whenever I hang out with their kids are actually so much smarter than I think they are. And so listening to your children, being aware of what they're going through, I'm sure, is stuff that you guys encourage as well, because yeah, I mean, there's so, especially in the day and age of social media and so much happening on phones and stuff like that. There's just a lot of new ways that relationships are turning unhealthy and stuff like that in the online space. And so yeah, just listening, being aware, being educated, that would be my biggest advice.
Well, that's great.
Yeah.
Hannah, thank you so much. And thank you for offering to stay in the group for a couple of days in case people have questions they want to add in the comment section, and for sharing so many resources with us. We really appreciate it. We value the work that you're doing, and we just can't thank you enough.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me on. I'm just very excited. Definitely want our space to be safe and supportive for the LGBT plus community. So please come over to our group. If this is an important topic to you, highly encourage you to come over and gain support, or, get educated as well. So.
Thanks. All right, Mama Bears. See you next time.